Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Lerida Geisha wash processed Panama from Leuchtfeuer Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Leuchtfeuer, based out of Wedel, Germany. And this coffee was featured in our most recent blind taste test rankings video, where it finished 7th place out of 7 high-end Panamanian and Ecuadorian coffees on that day. That being said, I don't feel that was an indictment on this coffee, but rather the quality that was present on that table, as the main reason for this coffee's placement was because it didn't quite stand out as much as some of those other coffees. With that being said, a lot of people know that washed Panamanian geishas are my favorite coffee in the entire world, so any opportunity I get to review one is one that I will happily embrace, and this coffee is certainly no exception to that, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Leuchtfeuer's recipe, which is a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one, our previous experiences in the past with this coffee roaster have been on the lighter side of things. That being said, drinking this alongside coffee roasters like Café Circular and Apollon's Gold, it became quite apparent that they don't roast quite as light as those coffee roasters. So I feel like the best way to define this one is maybe on the slightly developed side of a Nordic Light in terms of that roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and that was the blind taste test day. And as kind of mentioned, this coffee wasn't necessarily standing out from that first impression, but when isolated from those other coffees, what was really noticed was this long-lasting and much more subtle florality to the cup. And those were some really positive traits, as really seeming to separate it from those other coffees. This one, I want to say, stood out just a little bit more. It was a solid first impression, even though it placed as low as it did. So I really think that the main reason for it kind of not standing out as much was because it wasn't quite as vibrant, but rather a little bit more subtle and delicate from that first try. Day 17 through the Chemex, and this was a much better second impression once again when it was isolated from those other coffees, as it does feel like it needs an extended cool down before it really opens up into a wonderfully crisp floral component with plenty of the soft peachy aspects as well. Subtle and delicate, so a very beautiful cup. It was a very pretty cup right from the onset, and this didn't necessarily do anything to take away from that, as we had another positive day. Day 23 through the April brewer after an extended rest. And there's positivity at the forefront this time, as it's much more vibrant with the listed melon being a more dominant component. And this in itself was another reason to maybe try this through the April brewer one more time, as the finish does have a much stronger focus on this light, bright, grassy aspect, but also this unripened peach. So it was a solid day all around nonetheless, and it just felt a little bit different, but I really feel like that positive kind of vibrancy right at the forefront was something that did help this brew method stand apart a little from the others. Day 26 adjusted to Leuchtfeuer's recipe, and the coffee was the best it had been up to this point, as it felt the most even and balanced, with far less of the grassiness that I had experienced from the previous days, as it had a much more even citric base to it. White flowers were at the forefront in a much more clean manner, with great sweetness and greater definition to the listed melon. So just in general, I really liked the evenness that was present on this day, and that's why I opted for this recipe with this brew method, as that one was the one that really seemed to shine the most. Day 29 through the Chemex with Leuchtfeuer's recipe, and once again, I felt like the V60 was just a better day, as this one seemed to accentuate a little bit more of those citric characteristics, with the listed peach being a little bit more faint and the florals not quite as well defined. So just an okay day on this one. Day 32, another nice day through the V60, as it continues to offer a very even citric base, with the white flowers being at the forefront. The entire cup remains mostly delicate, with a subtlety to the peach as well as the listed melon aspects of this one, both present in a slightly sugary sense as well, so a really nice day on this one as well. Day 35 through the Chemex with Leuchtfeuer's recipe, and it was nice in this brew method as well, as it was offering, again, plenty of those citric characteristics, but they seem to have toned down just a little bit with time, as there's an added clarity to the base. Still a notable citric forward aspect to the cup, but it transitions well into this peachy characteristic in this intermediary before settling into a delicate florality, as well as soft, fresh fruit. Of course, that being a combination between the melons, as well as that peachiness. So Day 35 was another nice day, but final notes we have for this one is day 37, as we opted for the V60 with the final brews. And the conclusion I came to is that this coffee is really nice, but it doesn't specifically focus in a direction. So a lot of these things we'd experienced, the florality, that's going to be the most defined of them. But other than that, the citrus, the peachiness, as well as that, what else am I missing? That kind of melon aspect, all three of those things maybe not quite as focused, or one doesn't seem to stand out any more so than the other things within it. So other than that, there's just a fair bit of brightness that seems to maybe go in a unspecific direction. So that's kind of my takeaway from it, but that's something that will be demonstrated right here. So let's go ahead and put up that tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, and we have 2 level 5s. So let's go through those real quick, and we'll start with the cleanliness, level 5. And yes, this is a very clean cup of coffee. I always say it's the washed Panamanian Geishas that tend to score level 5 in terms of the clarity, so this one right here is certainly no exception to that, as this was a very clean coffee, and there were moments where I felt like, yes, this is very much a Panamanian Geisha. It has so much subtlety and delicacy to it, and you can taste all of these flavors in a very defined manner to them. So level 5 does feel quite fitting for this coffee. Florality, level 5. Yes, and this one I actually put a specific note on there so I wouldn't miss this, but I kind of marked it at a 4.5 because while it is a little bit more pronounced as the fruit components within this one, it's maybe not quite as well defined or overly specific, other than maybe a little bit more of a generic white flower aspect to it. I'm not entirely sure. It just says elegant florals. Okay, that works for me because it just does really feel like some really nice, delicate light flowers, a lot of pretty and beauty within the florality of this one. And then we have quite a few level 4s. We will start with the finish, level 4. Yes, typically when I am consuming washed Panamanian Geishas, they tend to have a very clean and even finish to them. This one right here, of course, is no exception to that. And when they do kind of reach both of those marks, so the cleanliness level 4 and the the cleanliness level 5 and the finish level 4, then that seems to be a really good kind of work together. And with the sweetness also there at that level 4, all three of those things are quite nice, especially for Panamanian Geishas, as typically with that you can expect a very kind of clean and defined base to the cup. Next up we have the acidity level 4. Yes, this one actually had a little bit more brightness than I might have expected, and that was coming in the slightly grassy sense, which is interesting given I'd kind of highlighted the roast profile of this one, but that's something we might discuss with some of the other coffees in the series from Leuchtfeuer. This one right here, a fair bit of brightness to it, so level 4 definitely feels justified. And then all three of the fruit components scoring a level 4, beginning with the berry. And they did list that, I want to say it was a honeydew melon. Yes, I could definitely see that. Again, for me, maybe a little bit more of a generic melon component to it, but definitely a lot of those sweeter melon fresh fruit characteristics to it. And of course, that would fall in line with that level 4 for that berry fruit. Citrus, level 4, yes. And there were times I really seemed to struggle with the lemongrass-like aspect of this one, as it did have a fair bit of that brightness, and it was coming out a little bit zesty in terms of that citrus. At times, I could say that was maybe the second most pronounced characteristic to this one. Stone fruit, level 4, honestly, a little generous. There were times it was quite well defined, quite well pronounced, but for the most part, it was a little bit more of a subtle, lingering afterthought as opposed to something that was a little bit more direct and pronounced, as maybe say the lemongrass or the florality that's within this one. Last thing worth discussing, body level 2. Oftentimes when it comes to Panamanian Geishas, they can score all the way down there at that level 1. This right here had at least a little bit of texture to it, so that is something that is worth noting. Not quite as tea-like as a lot of other Panamanian Geishas. Of course, the V60 might play a role in that, but other than that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think that it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. So this one did finish 7th, but I can definitely say that it wasn't my least favorite of those 7 coffees, as this one did improve with time. And drinking it on its own, I was able to appreciate so many of the wonderful things that it did offer. When it comes to Panamanian Geishas, I have to be very picky about, kind of just nitpicky in general about these coffees. And this one was nice. It offered everything I'm looking for: clarity, sweetness, florality, as well as fruit components to it. But I think the biggest grievance and takeaway I have to have about this one is that maybe there wasn't a fruit focus that I would have liked. If I was able to get a little bit more of those peachy aspects and tone down a little bit more of the citrus, then maybe we're starting to talk about how good this coffee was. Even with that being said, there's nothing wrong with it at all. I mean, it is very much in line with a lot of what I might expect from a Panamanian Geisha. And for, I believe, being the cheapest out of all of the coffees that we did purchase for that series, I do have to say that it held up against all of those other coffees is it turned out to be a very nice one by the end. If anything, I couldn't necessarily tell that this one was any cheaper or maybe not quite as high of a scoring coffee as those other ones. So that's a nice testament to this coffee, and I would say the coffee roaster as well, as I feel like they did a pretty nice job of this one, even if there wasn't anything that specifically stood out too much about it. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to: obviously somebody like myself. That's the first place I want to focus if you do like your washed Panamanian geishas, and this one offered so many of those components that you're looking for, clarity of course being the big one. But to kind of go alongside of that, I think the lemongrass is what really stood out the most about this, that was maybe a little bit more unique from a lot of other Panamanian geishas we've had in the past. So that's the first direction I could point somebody towards, but it does have complexity to it. There are quite a few fruit components to it, and then the florality is the second most defining characteristic to it. Well, I would actually say the most defining characteristic to it outside of the clarity in general. So there are a lot of really nice positives to take away. Best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Lerida Geisha wash processed Panama from Leuchtfeuer Coffee. Thank you for watching.